perched high on a forgotten hillside in the heart of rural Ireland, where the boreen narrowed to a faint track and silence truly began. A young pregnant woman was striving to survive alone in a small stone cottage, barely holding itself together. With no family, no husband, no one, she had been abandoned months earlier by the man who had promised to care for her. All that remained was that humble dwelling amidst the wild heath and the child growing within her. Everyone in the small local community whispered the same thing. No one could live out there alone. But Fiona had nowhere else to go. Until one ordinary morning, as the sun was just beginning to crest the green hills and the peat track lay damp with the morning mist, a stranger appeared, walking slowly along the track. He approached slowly, leading 2 goats, tethered by a rope, and carrying a long-handled spade over his shoulder. In the countryside, silence held a different weight. It wasn't like the silence of the city during a power cut, or when the streets emptied in the dead of night. That fleeting, fragile, quiet people sought with headphones, only to have it shattered the moment traffic resumed. The silence of the countryside was far deeper, much more profound. It emanated from the heath, from ancient gnarled hawthorns and sparse pine groves that sometimes obscured the sun even before midday. It came from the wind sighing through the tall grasses and reeds, a sound that wasn't quite a sound, so continuous, so ever-present, that the mind eventually ceased to register it. And it came from the distant crow of a rooster, always seeming too far away, somewhere beyond the verdant hills where the heather grew in wild tufts. In that little stone cottage, nestled among the green slopes, silence was Fiona's sole companion. That Monday in September 2019 began like countless others. The sun hadn't quite reached its zenith. It was that time of morning when the light was warm, softly silver, and the air still held a lingering chill from the dawn. Fiona had woken early, as she did every day, her body no longer able to sleep for long stretches. Her belly was heavy, her back ached, and it felt as though the baby was waking earlier with each passing day, as eager to be born as she was for its arrival. Her name was Fiona O'Connell. She was 24 years old and 7 months and 2 weeks pregnant. The house she lived in wasn't exactly a house, it was more a remnant of one. The stone walls were cracked in numerous places, not just hairline fractures, but deep fissures you could insert a finger into. The old lime render had dried and contracted over time, then tried to reunite itself with each winter's dampness, creating a pattern of cracks that resembled a map of some forgotten place. The slate roof, which must have gleamed vibrantly in older times, was now a faded gray, with many slates missing or dislodged. When it rained, and rain was practically a guarantee between October and March, drips would begin in at least 5 different spots. Fiona had placed buckets, pots, and even a large plastic container at these points to catch the water. At night, the sound of those drips, plink, 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 was like a hypnotic metronome that kept her awake, counting the drops as she waited for sleep. The wooden door, serving as the cottage's entrance, shrieked every time the wind gusted. It was a high-pitched, jarring sound that resonated through the entire structure of the small dwelling. Fiona had tried oiling the hinges weeks prior, but the rust and constant exposure to the elements had rendered it useless, and now the creak was worse than ever. But it was all she had, and at that point in her life, it was also the only place where no one could tell her to leave. Fiona had arrived there 6 months earlier. It wasn't a place she had chosen. In truth, she hadn't chosen anything in that period of her life. Things had simply happened, one after another, like dominoes toppling across a table. She had come with a small bag of clothes, faded t-shirts, a pair of jeans torn at the thigh, a few items her mother had left behind, and a secret growing within her belly, a secret that was no longer a secret by the time she arrived, as her burgeoning stomach revealed all she tried to hide. The child's father had left. His name was Liam Murphy. He was a handsome man of 42 who had come from Dublin to work on an excavation project at a new quarry opening about 15 kilometers away. He was alone, separated from a woman who lived in the city. And when he saw Fiona, who was 23 at the time, with a face still soft, still possessing the innocence that the countryside offered girls who had never left it, he decided he wanted her. The first few weeks were magical. He would take her for drives into Clifton in his comfortable car. He paid for meals in restaurants where she had never eaten. He said beautiful things. He said he loved her, that he wanted to marry her, that the quarry project would last for years, and he would make a fortune, and they would travel together, and she would have a better life than the one she knew. Fiona believed him. Why wouldn't she? No one in her life had ever lied to her like that. Her mother was too honest. Her father, who had died when she was 10, had been a man of few words but great integrity. She had no frame of reference for distrust. So, she lay with Liam and became pregnant. The promises lasted only a few weeks after that. First came the excuses. He was too busy at the quarry. Then came longer intervals between their meetings. Now he could only see her once a week. Then came the cryptic messages. "Hello, darling, but I have something difficult to tell you." And then, nothing. Silence, blocked calls, disappearance. Fiona had tried to find him. She had gone to the quarry, but they told her he had been dismissed for not showing up to work. She sought out the house where he lived in Clifton, but the landlady didn't know where he had gone. His few friends in the area also knew nothing. Then came the days without news. Then weeks, then months. Until one day, Fiona realized the truth was simpler than any excuse she could invent for herself. He was never coming back. Her father had died when she was a child. Her mother was in Cork, remarried, with a new life. Her siblings, yes, she had 2 brothers, were scattered across Ireland, some in England, some in America. No one offered help. No one offered a roof. No one offered even a word of comfort beyond a quick, "Ah, sure, Fiona." Too fast to be genuine. So, Fiona had fallen into a panic. Pure, genuine, terrible panic. And then she had heard there was an empty cottage on a hillside in the middle of the heath. A house that had belonged to an old couple who had died and left everything to their children living in the cities. A house no one wanted. A house that could be hers. Not officially, not legally, but de facto. She had walked there with her small bag of clothes, opened the unlocked door, and stepped into that place that would be her refuge for the coming months. And that was how she began to live there, planting a few potatoes behind the cottage in a patch of land that had once been a small garden. Potatoes were hardy. They didn't ask for much, and she knew how to grow them because her grandmother had kept a small plot when Fiona was a child. She fetched water from the small burn that ran a few yards away, walking barefoot along the path she had created with her own steps, carrying heavy buckets that chafed her shoulders and hands, trying to ignore the fear that crept in every night when the heath grew too dark. A fear that was both vague and very, very specific. The fear of being alone, the fear that something might happen to the baby and there would be no one to help. The fear of the stories people told about that place, tales of wanderers lost in the bog, never to be found, of treacherous weather that could strand you for days, of old spirits that roamed the land after the sun set. That morning, however, something different happened. Fiona was standing near the old wooden fence that marked out what would have been her yard. She had thought about trying to mend some of the posts that were starting to rot, but abandoned the idea when weariness overcame her. Everything made her tired. Now, any tiny movement seemed to drain all her energy. She was holding her belly with one hand, not because the baby was kicking at that specific moment, but because her stomach weighed so heavily that supporting some part of it, distributing that weight between her arms and back, was the only way she could stand there for more than a few minutes without the back pain becoming unbearable. Her hair was pulled back in a disheveled ponytail. She wore a simple beige cotton dress that had once been pretty, but was now faded and stained with earth that wouldn't wash out. Her feet were bare. She had learned never to wear shoes while pregnant, as her feet swelled, and then she couldn't get anything tight off. Her skin was weathered by the wind and sun, a deep russet tone that now seemed permanent, and her hands were calloused from working the land. She was gazing down the peaty track that wound down the hillside when she first saw the movement. Someone was coming along the path. At first, she thought it was her imagination. In the past few months of living alone, her mind had begun to play tricks on her. Sometimes, she would hear voices or see people who weren't there. What psychologists called hallucination, Fiona simply called her mind going astray. But it wasn't imagination, it was a figure that moved, growing larger as it approached, a man. He walked slowly, pulling 2 goats tethered by a rope of ancient fiber. The goats were small, one white, the other dappled in black and brown. They moved at a leisurely pace, seemingly accustomed to his rhythm. Over his left shoulder, carried casually as if it weighed nothing, was an old tool with a worn handle, darkened by time and use. It was a simple, long-handled spade, exactly the kind of thing someone would use to work the land, to dig, to prepare the soil for planting. Fiona felt her heart quicken. She had seen only a few men in the past 6 months. She had seen the occasional traveling fruit and veg seller who passed every couple of weeks. She had seen Father Seamus who came to perform services. She had seen a few local boys who sometimes appeared asking for water, but she hadn't seen anyone like this. No one who simply emerged from the wild heath, bearing the raw aspect of someone accustomed to living close to nature. When the man reached a distance where he could see her clearly, and she him, they both paused for a few seconds, gazing at each other in the silent heath. The man's skin was tanned by sun and wind. His hair was dark and long, reaching the collar of a faded denim shirt unbuttoned at the chest. He had several days' growth of beard, the kind that appears when one hasn't shaved for a week or more. His eyes were dark too, almost black, but there was something in his gaze that wasn't hard. It was observant, calm, as if he were accustomed to examining things before passing judgment. He stopped a few feet away. The goat stopped too, appearing as cautious and observant as he did. "Hello," he said. His voice was hoarse, as if he didn't speak much, as if his vocal cords were accustomed to silence. "Hello," Fiona replied, her voice coming out thinner than she intended, a hint of fear she couldn't hide. "Do you live here?" he asked. "Yes," Fiona said. "I do." The man looked at the cottage, at the fence, at the small patch of land where Fiona had planted potatoes. His gaze was systematic, observant, as if he were assessing the place. "Alone?" he asked, and then, before she could reply, his eyes fell upon her belly, and he saw it all: the pregnancy, the solitude, the fear she was trying to keep hidden. Fiona didn't answer immediately. "Yes," she finally said, "alone." The man nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "My name is Thiaran," he said. "I'm looking for a place to work, to stay. I have experience with the land, with planting, with—" He gestured towards her small plot. All this, Fiona didn't know what to say. Her heart was still racing. Part of her was afraid. Another part, a part she barely recognized in herself, felt something akin to relief. Relief at the prospect of company. Relief at not being utterly alone in the middle of the heath. At that moment, however, she still didn't know who this man was, and he knew almost nothing about her. But that simple encounter, on that ordinary morning, in the quiet of the heath, would completely alter the course of their story. Because sometimes life doesn't offer grand opportunities in grand moments. Sometimes life offers a long-handled spade and 2 goats, and the chance to start anew. Thiaran wasn't an easy man to get to know. There were qualities in him that people needed time to understand. A silence that wasn't exactly shyness, a stillness that wasn't a lack of intelligence, a solitude that didn't come from an inability to connect with others, but from the experience of having lost so much that connections became a luxury difficult to allow oneself. He was 31 years old. He had been born in Galway, a larger city than Clifton, and had grown up in a family of farm workers who knew every inch of the land they lived on. His father had been a farmer. His mother had been a farmer's wife, working as hard as her husband, only invisibly. Thiaran had an older brother named Sean, who had left for London when he was 18, seeking the promises of a better life in the big city. He had never returned, never even called. Working the land was all Thiaran knew. Since childhood, even before learning to read properly, he learned to identify types of soil, to feel the moisture, to know when it was time to plant and when it was time to harvest. His father said this skill wasn't taught in schools. It was something that came from the blood, the lineage, from generations of ancestors who had learned to converse with the earth through their hands. Until was 22. Thiaran's life was predictable. He worked, planted, harvested, helped his father. Sometimes he went to local seelage or pub nights where he would dance a tune or two, drink a pint of stout, talk with friends about harvests and rains and market prices. It was a simple life, but it was a life that made sense, a life where things had order and purpose. Then he met Aisling. She had come from Cork with her parents, who were visiting relatives in the area. She was 20, with long black hair and a laugh that sounded like music. Thiaran saw her at a gathering and could never think of anything else. He worked up the courage to speak to her. He succeeded. They talked for hours. She found his stories about the land interesting. He found her intelligence, her way of seeing the world, mesmerizing. She lived in Cork. He lived near Galway. The distance was only 130 kilometers, but in those days, without his own car, that distance was practically the difference between 2 different worlds. Thiaran had saved money for 2 years, saving every euro he earned. His parents asked what he was saving so much for, and he hadn't told them. But after 2 years of hard work, waking before dawn, working until the sun set, he had enough money to buy a battered Ford Focus from '98 that barely ran, but it ran. With that car, he had driven to Cork every week for 3 years. 3 years of traveling in the dead of night, to return in the dead of night, because he needed to be back at work. 3 years of fuel that cost most of his wages. 3 years of exhaustion that accumulated like layers of earth in a plowed field. But he did it because he loved Aisling, in a way that had no words, in a way that made him capable of enduring any sacrifice. Then, one day, When he was 25, he asked Aisling to marry him. It wasn't a formal, elegant proposal. He was driving back from Cork. She was sleeping in the passenger seat. And when she woke up, he simply said, "I want to marry you. I want you to come live with me. I want to spend my life with you." And she said, "Yes." She cried, actually. Tears of joy that ran down her face as she kissed him. They married 3 months later, in a small ceremony in the community where Ciaran lived. Aisling had left her job in Cork, left her family, and had come to live with Ciaran and his parents in the family farmhouse where he had been born. The first 2 years were happy, truly happy. Aisling learned about life on the farm. She worked in the fields alongside Ciaran. She cooked, helped with household chores. She seemed genuinely content. And then she became pregnant, a girl. They knew it was a girl from the ultrasound they had in the town. They decided to name her Soise. Ciaran had never felt so happy, so complete, so certain that he had made the right decision by dedicating his life to that place, that woman, that child on the way. Aisling's pregnancy was easy. She glowed, seeming more beautiful each day. Ciaran built a wooden crib with his own hands, painted the girl's room, bought tiny clothes and toys. He planned the future with a hope that seemed almost naive. Soise was born on a rainy night in November 2012. It was a difficult birth. Aisling bled too much. But the girl was born healthy, with all her tiny fingers, all the teeth she would later have, and a cry that Ciaran later described as the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. In the first few months, everything was chaos, but a happy chaos. Night awakenings, nappies, crying, but also smiles, laughter, moments where Ciaran would hold Soise and look at her tiny, minute face and feel a kind of love he had never imagined existed. When Soise was 3 months old, Aisling said she wanted to return to Cork for a week to visit her mother. Ciaran saw no problem. He would take care of Soise. His mother would help him. Aisling left. She said she would be back in a week. She never returned. The first week turned into 2. Ciaran called her mobile number, and the call went to voicemail. He drove to Cork. He found Aisling's mother, who seemed as confused and frightened as he was. She said Aisling had left a day early, that she had left a note saying she needed to leave, that she couldn't live that way anymore, that she needed freedom. Freedom. The word echoed in Ciaran like a bell ringing in an empty church. Aisling had gone, simply disappeared, left Soise behind, left Ciaran behind, left the life they were building behind, as if it had all been just a temporary mistake that needed correcting. The months that followed were the worst of Ciaran's life. He had entered a kind of paralysis that wasn't exactly depression, but something close. He continued to wake up, continued to care for Soise, continued to feed her, clean her, hold her during the nights when she cried. But inside, he was broken in a way that no amount of mending could repair. His father died 2 years later, a sudden heart attack while working in the fields. Ciaran had found his body fallen among the cornstalks. He was 28. Suddenly, he was not only an abandoned husband, a single father, but also the man responsible for the entire property, all the crops, all the rural life that his mother depended on him to survive. His mother worsened after her husband's death. She developed an illness that doctors couldn't exactly diagnose, something that left her weak, that made her sleep most of the day, that stole from her the will to live. She died 2 years later, in November 2016. Soise was only 4 years old. Ciaran was left alone, completely alone. He had a young daughter, a property no one wanted, and a heart that had stopped beating at any rhythm that could be considered normal. He had tried, God knows he had tried. He worked, cared for Soise, sent her to school in the small community, kept the property running, even if barely, even if most of his work was just trying to survive day after day. Then, when Soise was 8 years old, in 2020, her grandmother from Cork appeared, Aisling's mother. She came with legal papers, with documents that showed Aisling wanted Soise to be raised by her, that this had been Aisling's wish all along, to leave her daughter, but to leave her prepared to be raised by her mother when she got older. Ciaran fought legal battles, arguments, tears, but the truth was he could barely keep himself alive. How could he offer a stable life for a child? The grandmother had money, had a house in Cork, could offer education, opportunities, so he let Soise go. The day she left, he sat under a gnarled hawthorn tree and cried in a way he had never cried before, in a way that emptied him completely. After that, Ciaran wandered, literally. He no longer had a reason to stay on that property. He sold it to a man who wanted to expand his fields. With the money, he had bought the 2 goats and an old spade his father had left. and he had started walking. For 3 years, he had walked across rural Ireland. He went from community to community, offering his labor in exchange for food and a place to sleep. He worked on farms, helped build sheds, did whatever needed to be done, and at the end of each day, when the sun set and the silence of the heath began, he would sit alone and think of Sauers and Aisling and his parents and all the things he had lost. The goats were his company. He had named them Hope and Memory. The white one was Hope, the dappled one was Memory. They accompanied him on his journeys, and sometimes he would talk to them, tell them stories, ask if they also believed life could be different. When Ciarán appeared on that hillside in County Galway, he had been walking for almost 3 years. His hair was longer, his beard thicker, his body leaner, not exactly thin, but wiry, taut, like someone who had learned to live on little. His skin was permanently tanned by the wind and sun, and his eyes, those dark eyes Fiona had noticed, carried a kind of wisdom that only comes from deep loss. He had heard about the area in a casual conversation in a local pub. Someone had said there was good land to be worked there, that there were people who needed help, that there was work. So he had decided to come, not because he believed anything could change, that kind of hope had died in him long ago, but because he needed to be somewhere, and one place was as good as another when you had lost everything that mattered. He had been walking the track that morning, following directions someone had given him in the nearby village, when he saw the cottage, a small stone structure, with a patch of land beside it where crops grew. Exactly the kind of place where he could offer his labor. Exactly the kind of place where he could disappear and not be bothered. Then he saw the pregnant woman, alone, with that same kind of fear in her eyes that he had seen in his own face so many times. When he woke from nightmares, when he received bad news, when he realized he couldn't save his daughter, something within Ciarán stirred at that moment. Something that had been dead for so long that he had forgotten it could move again. And he had stopped and said his name and offered what he had, his hands, his experience, his solitude, because Ciarán understood solitude. He was made of solitude, and the idea of leaving that pregnant woman there, alone, facing the heath and the silence, was something his heart, damaged as it was, could not bear. So he stayed, not because he believed he could change things, but because a baby was coming into that world, and no one deserved to face that kind of solitude. No one deserved to be left behind as Aisling had left him, as life had left him. He simply could not allow it to happen again, even if only on a small scale, in a forgotten corner of the world. Even if it was only for a woman he had met 5 minutes earlier. Fiona's answer had been simple: you can stay. Nothing more, nothing less, just those 4 words that changed everything. Ciarán had nodded, as if he had received exactly the answer he expected. He had tethered the 2 goats to a post at the side of the cottage, and had started to work. First, he had repaired the fence. He worked through that entire first morning, reinforcing the rotting posts, replacing the irreparable timbers with better pieces of wood he had scavenged from an abandoned shed a few kilometers away. He worked in absolute silence, that kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable, but concentrated. The silence of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. Fiona had watched him from the porch, not because she was specifically curious about his work, though she was, but because she was afraid. That primitive kind of fear that comes when you let a stranger onto your property. A fear she had come to know well in the past months of solitude, when any different noise would wake her at night, when any shadow had the potential to be a threat. But something about that man was not threatening. There was something in his tired face, in his slow, determined movements, that left no room for fear. He simply worked, as if work was the only language he truly understood. At night, Fiona had prepared a meal. Nothing elaborate. Potatoes, a few greens she had planted, perhaps some stew. Ciarán had eaten in silence, sitting outside the cottage on a small wooden stool. When he finished, he had looked at the plate and then at Fiona, and had simply said, "Thank you." She had left a space for him to sleep in the shed, away from the cottage. She had put a rough bed of hay there, an old blanket, and a pillow she had filled with straw. He had accepted without asking questions. That first night, hearing him settle in the shed, the creak of the planks, the sound of someone preparing for sleep, Fiona had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Security, not complete security, not yet, but the feeling that there was another body on the property, another pair of eyes that could see things she couldn't see from the porch, another heart beating in the same space as hers. The security of not being completely alone. The following days settled into a routine that would become commonplace. Ciarán woke early, at 5 a.m., when the first grey-green of dawn began to spread across the horizon. Fiona would hear the shed door close, hear his footsteps on the earth, and then begin to see the results of his work. On the second day, he had repaired the roof. That task Fiona had put on her list of things to do one day when I have the courage had been completed in a single day of concentrated effort. Ciaran had climbed onto the roof barefoot, moving with the ease of someone who had grown up scaling wooden structures and had replaced the missing slates, sealing the leaks that made that hypnotic night noise. On the third night, when it rained, Fiona woke expecting to hear that dripping sound, and it never came. The silence was different now. It was a silence that carried no fear. It was the silence of rain falling on a roof that protected her. She had cried that night, not exactly from sadness, but from that kind of crying that comes when the pressure one has accumulated finally finds an outlet, as if all the weight of the past months, the solitary pregnancy, the fear of the unknown, Liam's abandonment, could finally dissolve into tears. On the fourth night, Ciaran had fallen ill. Fiona had found him lying on the rough bed in the shed, trembling, sweating. He had worked all day repairing the wooden structure of the porch, heavy labor that left him under the warm September sun. When he came in at night, he had developed a fever, a kind of fever that made his eyes glaze over, that made him mumble things in his sleep. Fiona had hesitated. For a few moments, she had stood at the shed door, watching him. Part of her wanted to back away, leave him alone. He was a stranger, after all. She didn't know him. There was no obligation for her to care for him. But there was another part of her, the part that still believed in things like kindness and compassion, that had won out. She had brought fresh water she had fetched from the burn, had soaked a cloth in warm water and placed it on his forehead. She had stayed awake most of the night, changing the cloth whenever the fever made it too warm. By morning, the fever had broken. Ciaran had woken and seen Fiona sleeping in a chair beside him, her head fallen back uncomfortably. When he stirred, she woke. "How do you feel?" she had asked. "Better," he had said. His voice was still hoarse, but there was a clarity in it that hadn't been there the night before. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Sorry for getting sick." "You don't choose to get sick," Fiona had replied. Something in that moment, something about that simple conversation, about that pregnant woman caring for a man she had met only 3 days before, had created a bond between them. For the first time, they talked as human beings, not just as two people sharing the same space. "When is the baby due?" Ciaran had asked. He was lying in the bed, still too weak to move much, but his mind seemed clear now. 2 months, Fiona had answered, more or less. The doctor in Clifton said it would be in November. 1st of November, possibly. "Are you afraid?" he had asked. Fiona had been honest. "Yes." "What's the name?" Ciaran had continued. "Haven't decided yet," Fiona had said. "I'm thinking Finn, or perhaps Patrick. Something that sounds strong, something that..." Fiona had hesitated, searching for the right words. "Something that sounds like he'll be able to survive here." Ciaran had nodded. "Finn is a good name. Do you have children?" Fiona had asked. The question had floated in the air of the small shed room. Ciaran had been silent for so long that Fiona was beginning to think she wouldn't get an answer. But then he had spoken. "I did," he had said. His voice had dropped so low that Fiona had to lean forward to hear him. "A girl, Saoirse. She's 10 now." He had paused. "I don't have contact with her anymore." Fiona had seen the pain pass over his face, like a shadow passing over the land. She hadn't asked any more questions. There was something about that silence, a sacred thing in it, that told her not to press further. Not at that moment. She had simply placed her hand on his arm. And Ciaran had done something he hadn't done in years. He had allowed someone to touch him without pulling away. In the days that followed, a routine settled in. Ciaran recovered. Slowly, he returned to work. And each day, the structure of Fiona's property transformed. The shed was mended, the garden expanded. A small drainage system was created to ensure rainwater wouldn't pool in the wrong places. Ciaran had even built a small greenhouse using plastic and salvaged wood, where Fiona could protect her more delicate plants. But the most important work Ciaran did wasn't with his hands, it was with words. During the evenings, when the day's work was done, he and Fiona began to talk. Nothing planned, nothing forced, just conversations that started when one of them suggested something and the other replied, and then the conversation unfolded like a slow-motion flower. She told him about her mother in Cork, about her siblings she rarely saw, about how she had always loved that land, but how the solitude had turned that love into something dangerous, something that was consuming her from within. He told her about his father, who understood the language of the land in a way Ciaran could never fully comprehend, but had spent years trying. About his mother, who had become withdrawn after her husband's death, who had died in her sleep, so quietly that he only noticed when he touched her in the morning. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Fiona in a chair, Ciaran on the ground, leaning against the wooden structure, Ciaran had pointed to the stars. "Do you see that one?" he had asked, pointing to a single bright spot among many. "Esling, my ex-wife. She believed that every person had a star in the sky, that when you die, you become a star, and you can talk to people through its light." Fiona had looked at the stars. "Do you believe that?" "No," Ciaran had replied. "But sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I see a star that shines brighter than the others. And I think maybe it's Sowers, that maybe she's up there somewhere looking down, seeing me." "Maybe she is," Fiona had said. "Maybe she's seeing the good man you are, even after everything." Ciaran had looked at her, and for the first time, his dark eyes had lost that veil of distance. There was a connection there, something that didn't yet have a name, but that was growing with each passing day. Fiona's life was changing. The fear was lessening. The nights weren't so long anymore. The work of cultivating that garden wasn't completely solitary. And the baby, she could feel, was also calming, as if that baby within her knew something different was happening, that it was no longer alone in the dark. Ciaran was changing too. The work had purpose again. There was someone depending on him. There was a reason to wake early, beyond just passing the time before he slept again. There was Fiona, pregnant and alone, and a baby coming, and the possibility, however remote, that he could make a difference, that he could prevent that child from growing up with the same solitude that Saoirse had grown up with. Neither of them had spoken about the future. There were no promises, no discussions about what would happen after the baby was born. But something was being built there, very slowly, very carefully, like someone building a stone cottage again, stone by stone, hoping that this time the structure would last. One night, when it was colder than usual, Fiona had experienced cramps, Braxton Hicks contractions. The doctor had called them when she had gone for the ultrasound. False contractions, the body practicing for true labor. But that night, she didn't know it was false. She had woken with pain in her back, in her sides, a tightening that came and went. She had cried out, unable to stop herself. Ciaran had rushed into the cottage. He had found Fiona standing in the bedroom, clutching her belly, her face contorted. "What's wrong?" he had asked, shifting into some kind of action mode. "No," Fiona had cried. "It's too early. It's not time." Ciaran had done that thing he had learned from his father many years ago. He had placed his hands on her belly, had felt the contraction, and had begun to speak. "It's all right," he had said, his voice calm, controlled. "It's just her body. The body is preparing. You are safe. You are here. You are not alone." And there was something in that voice, something in those words that had calmed not only Fiona, but also the baby. The contractions had lessened. The panic had transformed into controlled breathing. Ciaran had laid Fiona down on the bed, had placed a hand on her forehead, and had stayed there all night awake, watching her sleep, ensuring that if anything happened, she wouldn't be alone. When morning came, Fiona had woken and seen Ciaran sleeping in a chair beside her, his head fallen to the side, his face finally at peace. And she had understood in that moment, had understood that something was happening between them, something that had started in that first encounter with the two goats and the spade, but that had transformed into something very different, much deeper, much more real. It wasn't love yet, or perhaps it was, but a kind of love that was so new, so fragile, that Fiona was afraid to name it. It was something closer to gratitude, to recognition, to the understanding that no one should be alone, and that when two lonely people meet, something sacred can be born from it. Ciaran woke a few minutes later, saw Fiona awake, watching him. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," Fiona replied. "Thanks to you." Ciaran had simply nodded, but there was something in his eyes that had changed. Something that said he also understood that that casual meeting on the track had meant more than either of them had imagined, and that perhaps, just perhaps, they were both capable of saving each other. October arrived with a promise in the air. Literally, people in the nearby community spoke about how you could feel the rain coming days before it fell, how the air grew heavier, how the birds changed their song, how even the insects seemed to behave differently, as if those tiny organisms knew something humans were still waiting to comprehend. Fiona could feel it. Every night when she lay in bed, she pressed her hands against the glass of a small window on the east side of the cottage and felt the air. It was different, more humid, more alive, as if the entire planet was breathing deeper, preparing for something great. Ciaran could feel it too. He had spent his entire life reading the signs of the land and sky. So, a week before the first rain arrived, he had started to work faster. He and Fiona now worked as a team, not consciously, but naturally, as if their bodies had learned to move in sync. Ciarán prepared the land. Fiona planted the seeds in careful rows. He built small drainage channels. She collected water in large buckets, preparing reserves. He reinforced the shed's roof with tarpaulin. She organized the interior of the cottage to ensure no drip could reach what was important. At the end of September, when Fiona had only 3 weeks until her estimated delivery, Ciarán had brought a wooden cart he had acquired from a dealer in the nearby community. With that wood, he had extended the porch, creating a covered space where they could sit during the rains, watching the storm without getting wet. "Why are you doing all this?" Fiona had asked one evening when she heard him working in the dim light of a candle inside the cottage. She was lying in bed, her body now so heavy that sitting up had become a chore, and he had come inside to drink water before returning to work. Ciarán had stopped. He had looked at her for a long time before replying. "Because you deserve it," he had said simply. "Because that baby deserves it. Because," he had hesitated, searching for the right words, "because everything was falling apart, and now it isn't anymore." Fiona hadn't answered immediately. There was something in those words that was so honest, so direct, that she had felt tears well in her eyes. She had turned to her side so he couldn't see her face, but Ciarán had seen. He had sat on the edge of the bed and, for a moment, he had just let his hand rest on her belly, where the baby had begun to kick in response to the touch. "Finn is growing strong," Ciarán had said. "You're taking good care of him." "We are," Fiona had corrected. "We are taking good care of him. You are as involved in this as I am." Ciarán had nodded, but there was something in his face that was still guarded, still cautious, as if he wanted to believe those words, but was afraid to let hope fully blossom, as if hope for him was as great a danger as any other. The first rain arrived on a Tuesday night, soon after nightfall. It began as a murmur, just a few drops falling on the leaves of the trees, just a rhythmic pattern on some surfaces, but then it grew. The wind began to blow harder. What had been a murmur transformed into a constant roar. Fiona was awake. Sleeping was becoming increasingly difficult as the due date approached. She had heard Ciarán rush out of the shed. She had heard his quick footsteps, checking the roof cover, ensuring everything was secure. He had entered the cottage wet, his shirt clinging to his body, his hair falling in damp strands over his face. He had walked into a room without knocking. There had been a familiarity in that gesture that months earlier would have made Fiona shrink back in fear. Now it made her heart beat faster for a completely different reason. "All right?" he had asked. "Yes," Fiona had replied. "I'm safe here." "Completely," Ciarán had assured. "The roof is strong, the drainage channels are working. If it rains for days, you won't have a drop of unwanted water inside the house, I promise." Fiona had believed him. She had believed him because Ciarán had that kind of certainty in his voice that came from someone who had faced worse storms and survived. He had sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and had stayed there as the rain fell. They hadn't talked. They had just been together. Fiona had slept and woken several times that night, and each time she had woken, he was still there, awake, vigilant, like a protector. The rains continued for a week, every day, every night, the kind of rain that seems like it will never stop, that seems like the whole world is being washed, cleaned, starting anew. During that week, Fiona's property transformed. What had been dry, parched land turned into something lush. The potatoes Ciarán had planted began to glow with new life. The vegetables in the garden exploded in growth. Even the trees around the cottage seemed greener, more alive. And then, on the 7th day of rain, the conflict occurred. A letter had arrived, not for Fiona specifically, but for the cottage. Someone from the community had brought it, a man whose face and the name on the envelope Ciarán recognized. Fiona had opened it, and had seen that it was from the man who had acquired Ciarán's property years earlier. And the letter was an offer to buy. Ciarán had read over her shoulder. Fiona had felt his muscles tense. "He wants to buy the land?" Fiona had asked, confused. "No," Ciarán had replied. His voice had taken on that quality she hadn't heard in weeks. That distant, cold, guarded voice. "He wants to sell. He's offering the land to you, the property where we're living. He's saying he bought it years ago from me, but there's legal evidence suggesting I had rights to the property that I may not have fully exercised. He's offering to split the profit from a future sale with you, if you want to make a legal claim." Fiona had looked at the letter again. There were numbers there. Very large numbers. Numbers that could change her life. Numbers that could mean she would never again have to worry about money, about security, about Finn's future. "Do you want this?" Fiona had asked, watching Kieran's face. "It doesn't matter what I want," Kieran had replied, and that tone in his voice, that tone of someone who had learned long ago that his desires didn't matter, had broken something within Fiona. "It does matter," she had said, louder than she intended. "It matters because you're here. It matters because you worked this land. It matters because," she had hesitated, "because you're part of this." "I'm not," Kieran had replied. He had moved away from the letter, away from Fiona, and had walked to the window. The rain beat against the glass. "I'm a wanderer who showed up on a track. You're the one with the property. You're the one with the baby. You're the one with a life to build. If there's money there, you should take it." "And you?" Fiona had asked. "What will you do?" Kieran had been silent for so long that Fiona thought he wouldn't answer. But then he had spoken, still looking at the rain. "I'll do what I always do," he had said. "I'll take hope and memory and I'll walk. I'll find another place that needs work, another place where I can fill useful space." Fiona had felt panic rise in her chest. She had felt as if the ground beneath her feet was disappearing, as if that cottage that had been a refuge was becoming a vacuum again. "No," she had said. Her voice had become loud, desperate. "You can't just leave. You can't just disappear. Why not?" Kieran had asked, turning to face her, and there was pain in his eyes, so much pain that Fiona had understood, then understood that he had been through this before, that he had learned long ago to leave people before he had to be left. "You'll be fine. You have money now. You have security. You don't need me." "It's not about needing," Fiona had cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's about wanting. It's about the fact that you matter, that you're not just useful. You are," she had searched for the words. "You are important to me, to Finn, to," she hadn't finished the sentence, hadn't been able to say the words, "to my heart," hadn't been able to say, "I love you," in any way that felt true. But Kieran had understood anyway. He had seen it in her eyes, and something in him had broken. That wall he had built over years of losses had begun to crumble. He had walked to her and had sat on the bed. He had placed his forehead against hers and had begun to cry. Not loudly or theatrically, just silent tears that fell from his eyes onto his cheeks and then onto the bed. "I can't do this again," he had whispered. "I can't love someone and then lose them. I can't." Aisling left. Sauersh was taken. My parents died. "You are," he had paused. "You are the last thing I have of hope. And if I let that grow too much, if I let that become real, then when you leave me, when you find out you deserve someone better, something that isn't just a man who wandered across Ireland with 2 goats, I'll die. Literally, I'll die." Fiona had placed her hand on his face, had felt those tears still warm. "You won't lose," she had said. "I promise, I won't leave you. No matter what happens, I won't leave you." "You can't make that promise," Kieran had responded. "No one can." "I can," Fiona had insisted. "I'm making it now. Before God, before this rain, before everything that is sacred in this world, I won't leave you. Not because you're useful, not because you fixed my roof or planted my food, but because you are you, and because I see that even when you're broken, even when you're afraid, you keep showing up, you keep choosing to be here, you keep choosing to care for me and for Finn. And that," she had placed her hand on his heart, "that makes you worthy of being loved." Kieran had looked at her for a long time and then he had kissed her. It wasn't a passionate or cinematic kiss. It was a soft, delicate kiss, full of all the things neither of them had been able to say in words. When they pulled apart, Kieran had picked up the letter. "Tell the man no," he had said. "Tell the man that this property is yours, that it was given to you by circumstances greater than both of us. Tell the man that you won't make any legal claim. Tell the man that here is a place where someone is starting anew, and that the last thing that person needs is money to complicate everything." "And you?" Fiona had asked. "I'll stay," Kieran had replied. "If you want me, I'll stay as long as you want me to stay. And if one day you want me to go, I promise I'll leave without resentment. But as long as I can be here, as long as I can be with you and Finn, I'll be here." Fiona had cried again, but this time it was from relief, from joy, from hope. The rain continued for a few more days, but when it finally stopped, and the sun shone again on the wet land, something had changed on the property. It wasn't just the vegetation that had grown, it was the very air that felt different, felt filled with possibility, with the future. Kieran had made a small hand-carved wooden crib, with his way of working that transformed common wood into something with soul. He had placed a small sheet inside, had placed it next to Fiona's bed, very close. so the baby would be near during the nights. Finn will be safe here, he had said. And Fiona had understood that he wasn't just talking about the crib, he was talking about life, about the future, about the promise that this time neither she nor her son would be alone. Only 2 weeks remained until the birth, and when Fiona slept at night with Ciaran sleeping in a chair beside her, waiting to be near in case anything happened, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Labor began in the early hours of a Saturday morning. Fiona woke with a pain that was different from the false contractions she had felt weeks earlier. It was a pain that came from the depths, that radiated differently, that had a purpose. Her body knew, the baby knew, it was time. She had cried out, couldn't help it. It was a scream that came from somewhere primal within her, somewhere that knew on a cellular level that she was about to go through the greatest transformation of her life. Ciaran had woken immediately. He slept in the chair next to the bed, as he had done every night for the past 2 months. He was awake in seconds, touching her face, asking, "Is it now? Is it now?" "I think so," Fiona had moaned, her voice interrupted by another spasm of pain. "I need the doctor. I need help. I can't do this alone." "You're not alone," Ciaran had said, and there was such unwavering certainty in that statement that Fiona, for a brief moment, had believed everything would be fine. But there was a problem. The nearest doctor was in Clifton, more than an hour's drive away, and they had no car. Ciaran had a horse borrowed from a neighbor, an old, slow animal that had been irregularly fed. They could try, but the boreen was still muddy from recent rains. It could take 2 or 3 hours. And Fiona, from the way her body was behaving, might not have 2 or 3 hours. "I'll get the midwife," Ciaran had said, determined. "Bridie Gallagher. She's had 5 children. She knows how to do this." "You're going to leave me alone?" Fiona had asked, panic lacing her words. "For half an hour," Ciaran had replied. "An hour at most. You'll be strong. You are the strongest woman I know. You survived months alone, pregnant, afraid. You can survive half an hour alone." He had quickly prepared the cottage, brought warm water, placed clean cloths on the bed, lit candles around the room because the electricity was intermittent on that property. He had placed a small brass bell next to the bed. "If anything changes, if you feel it's getting worse, you ring this," he had said, placing the bell in her hand. "Mr. Og Walsh lives on a property you can hear from here. If you ring hard, he'll come running." "You'll come back quickly?" Fiona had asked, holding his hand. "As fast as my legs can carry me," he had promised, and had kissed her on the forehead. "Finn is coming into the world, and you are ready." Then he had left in the dark, running along the track he now knew so well, heading towards Bridie Gallagher's cottage, leaving Fiona alone with her son, who was now just hers, in that candlelit room, in that stone cottage, on a forgotten hillside. The next 40 minutes were like living centuries. The contractions came more frequently. Fiona walked back and forth across the room, holding her belly, feeling the baby move within her with an intensity that frightened her. She had cried out more than once. She had wept. She had prayed to things she didn't believe in, asking for help from divinities she wasn't sure existed. And then Ciaran had returned with Bridie Gallagher. Bridie Gallagher was 72, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a kind of calm that only comes from someone who had witnessed many births and understood that childbirth was, in fact, a perfectly natural process that women's bodies had performed for thousands of years before medicine and hospitals existed. "Let me see," she had said, and she had lifted Fiona's dress. She had examined her with hands that knew exactly what they were looking for. "My goodness, you're opened far too much. This baby will come soon, very soon." "How long?" Fiona had asked between groans. "Perhaps an hour," Bridie had replied. "Perhaps less. This baby is in a hurry to be born." Ciaran had stood in a corner of the room, trying not to get in the way, but also clearly unable to leave. Bridie Gallagher had looked at him. "Are you the father?" she had asked. There had been a long silence. Fiona had felt his heart beat through his hand, which was still holding hers. "Yes," Ciaran had replied. "I am." And in that simple word, he had claimed Finn. He had chosen to be a father not by DNA, but by presence, by choice, by the commitment to be there when it mattered most. Bridie Gallagher had nodded. "Then you stay here. She'll need you." The next hour was of contractions getting closer. Fiona began to breathe the way Bridie Gallagher asked. She began to move as her body demanded, and she began to feel a pressure that grew and grew, as if the baby was finally ready. "Ready to come out, ready to come into the world. You can start pushing," Bridie Gallagher had said. "When the contraction comes, you push with all the power you have." Fiona pushed, God knows she pushed. She had pushed as if she were trying to turn her pain into power, convert every tear into strength. And Ciaran had been there holding her hand, putting water on her forehead, whispering words of encouragement that she couldn't fully understand, but which she recognized as love. "Finn is coming," she had cried. "I can feel him. Keep pushing," Bridie Gallagher had instructed. "Keep going. He's almost here." Then, with a final cry that had come from the depths of her being, with a final push that had cost every ounce of strength she had, Finn was born. He had come out into Bridie Gallagher's hands, covered in blood and bodily fluids, his body small and perfectly formed. For a moment that had seemed eternal, he had been silent. No breath, no cry, just silence. Fiona had panicked. Why isn't he crying? Why? And then Finn had taken a breath and had let out a cry that had echoed through the entire cottage, through the surrounding heath, a primal and perfect sound of a child announcing his arrival in the world. Bridie Gallagher had quickly cleaned the baby, had cut the umbilical cord with scissors she had sterilized with fire. She had wrapped Finn in a clean sheet, the one Ciaran had prepared, and had placed the baby on Fiona's chest. "Here is your son," Bridie Gallagher had said, and there was a smile on her face, that smile that comes from witnessing a miracle. Fiona had looked at Finn, had looked at that tiny being who had arrived in the world, who had been inside her just minutes before, and now was out. He was breathing, he was alive. His tiny, swollen eyes were closed. His face was a mixture of his mother and a universal baby that all newborns seem to have. His small fingers were closed in tiny fists. She had begun to cry, tears that were pure joy, pure relief, and an amount of love so great that it was impossible to contain in a human body. And Ciaran had cried too. He had stood beside the bed, looking at Finn, and had wept. Not just tears, but silent sobs that shook through his entire body. "He's perfect," Ciaran had whispered. "He is," Fiona had agreed, and had pulled Finn closer to her heart. And he had begun to search for her breast, instinctively understanding what he needed to do. Bridie Gallagher had delivered the placenta. Ciaran had been surprised to learn there was another part that needed to come out, and had cleaned Fiona. She had certified that there was no dangerous hemorrhage. She had made sure that both mother and baby were vital and healthy. "You did well," she had said to Fiona. "Very well. You are a strong mother." Then she had turned to Ciaran and had placed a hand on his face. "And," she had said, "you are a man. A true man who is here, who is choosing. That is rare, very rare. Congratulations to the new father." Ciaran had nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Bridie Gallagher had stayed for a few more hours, making sure everything was well, teaching Fiona how to breastfeed. That first feeding had been clumsy, but it worked. And making sure the baby was breathing correctly, was warm, was healthy. "He will sleep now," Bridie Gallagher had said, "and you will sleep too. Your body needs rest. You lost blood. You used all your energy. Sleep." Then Bridie Gallagher had left, with Ciaran offering to accompany her back, and her refusing, saying she knew the way as well as she knew her own face. When Ciaran had returned, Fiona and Finn were sleeping. Fiona was lying on her side, Finn resting against her chest, both breathing in sync, both at peace. Ciaran had left a candle lit, had pulled the chair closer, and had simply watched. He watched Fiona as she slept. He watched Finn as he slept. He watched the two existing together now. Two beings who days earlier were one. Two beings he loved with an intensity that scared him. In the early morning, when Finn woke hungry, Fiona woke too. Ciaran had brought warm water, had helped position the baby, had stayed there while she nursed him. He had whispered stories to the baby, stories about the land, stories about goats that traveled to meet pregnant women, stories about how life, when it was hard, sometimes offered the most unexpected gifts. "He's ours," Fiona had whispered as Finn nursed, his eyes fixed on his face, with that concentration that very young babies have. "He is," Ciaran had agreed, and had placed his finger in Finn's small fist, and the baby had grasped it. And Ciaran had felt a connection run through him that was so deep it frightened him, because now he had something to lose again. Now he was connected to another human being in a way that couldn't be undone. Now he was vulnerable. But when he looked at Fiona, at her exhausted but radiant face, at her body that had performed a miracle, at the way she looked at Finn, as if he was the most precious miracle the universe had to offer, Ciaran understood something. He understood that that vulnerability was, in fact, the most valuable thing in the world, because it meant he was capable of loving, that he hadn't died inside when Aisling had left him, that he was capable of being present, that he was capable of being more than a man wandering across Ireland with two goats. He was capable of being a father. He was capable of being a partner. He was capable of being whole. And as the dawn began to break over the horizon, as the birds began to sing their welcoming songs for the new day, Ciarán placed his hand on Finn's face, that small face that was changing the world, and made a silent promise. "I'll be here," he had whispered. "For you, for your mother, for anything you need, I'll be here. I promise." And Ciarán had learned long ago not to make promises he couldn't keep. But this promise he knew he would keep, even if it cost him his life, even if it meant sacrificing anything else the world could offer, because Finn had been born, and with Finn came the future. And Ciarán had finally learned to believe in futures again. The first few weeks were organized chaos. Fiona slept only in fragments of time, an hour here, half an hour there, always waking when Finn cried, always offering to feed him. Her body, which had gone through the most violent transformation of her life, was slowly recovering. There were moments when she could barely get out of bed. There were moments when the bleeding wouldn't stop, and she was afraid. A primitive fear she didn't reveal to Ciarán, but that woke her in the middle of the night in a panic. Ciarán had become everything. He had become the mother, in the sense that he did everything a mother would do besides breastfeeding. He changed Finn's nappies, the ones he had made from soft cotton, and cloths he had torn and sewn together on nights when Fiona slept. He cleaned the baby when he had those brown newborn poos that seemed to come endlessly. He carried Finn as he walked through the cottage, rocking him gently, singing songs he wasn't sure were exactly melodies, but that seemed to soothe the baby. He cooked. He had learned from his mother decades earlier, but had abandoned that skill when everything had collapsed. Now he resurrected it. He made soups with bone broth that Fiona drank to regain strength. He made bread in a stone bread oven he had built outside the cottage. He made every meal with the intention not just to feed, but to heal. And he let Fiona rest. He insisted on it. There were nights when Finn woke crying, and Ciarán carried the baby to Fiona's bed to feed, and then carried him back when he was done, allowing Fiona to go back to sleep. "You need to rest," he insisted. "Your body went through a war. Let me take care of both of you." And she let him, because she was slowly learning to trust. In the third week, Bridie Gallagher had returned for a follow-up visit. She had examined Fiona, had examined Finn, and had nodded with approval. "You're recovering well," she had said to Fiona. "Your body is healing, and this baby," for she had picked up Finn, observing his tiny face, "this baby is perfectly healthy. You're feeding him well." But there was something in Bridie Gallagher's face when she had observed Ciarán caring for Finn, cleaning his mouth, calming a cry, that conveyed understanding, acceptance. "You love him?" Bridie Gallagher had said to Ciarán, not a question, but an affirmation. "Yes," Ciarán had replied simply. "That's good," Bridie Gallagher had responded. "A child needs love, from men who love and aren't afraid to show it. The world needs more of that." After Bridie Gallagher had left, Ciarán had sat with Finn in his lap. Fiona had watched him as he sang softly to the baby, and had completely understood that this man had transformed into something sacred to her. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just admiration. It was a kind of love that was so deep it frightened her. In the 5th week, the community began to know. Kilbeg was a small community where everyone knew everyone, and news spread faster than the October rains. Someone had seen Ciarán in Clifton buying nappies. Someone had heard a baby's cry coming from Fiona's property. Someone had noticed that Ciarán now effectively lived in a small cabin he had built just a few meters from Fiona's cottage, but that he spent every night with her, no longer isolated as he had been before. The first reactions were mixed. Bridie Gallagher had spread the truth, that Fiona had become pregnant by a man from the city who had abandoned her, that Ciarán had appeared just days before the birth and had stayed to help, that he was a decent man who was caring for both mother and baby. That story had won hearts. There was romance in it. There was redemption. But there were also judgments. There were women who whispered that Fiona had slept with a man without being married, and that was a sin. There were men who asked Ciarán if he was really going to care for a child that wasn't his. There were people who presumed Ciarán was just waiting for his chance to take advantage of the situation, to get Fiona pregnant again, or to take the property when she became vulnerable. One of these people was the community priest, Father Seamus O'Malley. He had appeared one Sunday, 2 months after Finn's birth. He had entered the cottage without knocking, with that kind of authority that priests often carry, the authority of someone who believed himself sent by God. "I came to see the child," he had said, "and also to speak with you, Fiona, about the state of your soul." Fiona had felt panic. There was something in his tone that made her uncomfortable. Ciarán, who had been in the shed, had appeared immediately. as if he could feel the change in the atmosphere. "Father," Ciarán had said, nodding respectfully. "You," Father Seamus O'Malley had said, pointing at Ciarán. "Are you the man?" "I am," Ciarán had replied. "And you are living here?" "Yes, with her, with the woman, with her and with Finn," Ciarán had replied. And there was something in his tone that was calm, but also firm, as if he were planting a flag. "We are a family." Father Seamus O'Malley had walked to the crib where Finn was sleeping. He had observed the baby for a long time. "This baby?" he had finally said. "Born out of wedlock. His mother lived in sin, and now a man who is not her husband is living here." He had turned to Fiona. "This cannot continue. You need to marry immediately to save your soul and the soul of this child." Fiona had felt Ciarán stiffen beside her. "With respect, Father," Ciarán had said, his voice still calm. "We will marry when it's right. Not because a man tells us we have to, but because we decide together that it's the correct time." "You will go to hell," Father Seamus O'Malley had responded, his face turning red. "Both of you will. This child will grow up without blessing, without salvation. This child," Ciarán had interrupted, "will grow up in a home where he is loved, where there is food, where there is security, where there are two people who, despite their sins, despite their faults, will love him with every fiber of their being. If that is hell, then let me burn eternally. But I don't believe it is. I believe God looks at this boy, at this mother, and sees exactly what I see. He sees love. He sees sacrifice. He sees two people trying to do what's right, even when the world is telling them they are wrong." There had been a silence so profound you could hear the sound of Finn breathing in the crib. Father Seamus O'Malley had turned and had left without saying anything more. But when he left, he had left something behind, a feeling that he had been confronted, and that perhaps, just perhaps, he had not been the authority in that room. After that day, things changed. That story of Ciarán defending his family against the priest himself spread through the community, and people began to see the situation differently. They began to see Ciarán not as a wanderer, but as a man who had made a choice. A difficult choice to love someone he was not obligated to love. A choice to build a life instead of destroying one. The first visitors arrived weeks later. Mary Kelly, who lived on the neighboring property, had come with a basket of food. She had brought a gift for Finn, a small hand-knitted shawl. "This is for my godson," she had said, looking at Finn with shining eyes. "Because someone needs to be his godparent, and since no one else offered, I'll take on the job." Others had followed. A cattle dealer had offered help with the property, suggesting he and Ciarán could work together on larger projects. A woman who had lost her daughter to the city had often visited, bringing books for Fiona, talking about life, offering that kind of friendship women need. And on a November day, exactly 1 year after their initial meeting, Ciarán had taken Fiona to the small white church. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't made an elaborate proposal. He had simply put Finn in a sling he had made, taken Fiona's hand, and led her to the place where Bridie Gallagher had married his parents, where Father Seamus O'Malley said his masses, even if neither of them went there anymore. And there, in front of the community, he had asked, "Will you marry me?" he had asked, his voice trembling, his hands shaking. "I know this isn't a perfect life. I know I'm not a perfect person, but I love you. I love Finn. And I want to spend the rest of my life taking care of you, loving you, being the best version of myself for you. Will you marry me?" Fiona had cried, and she had said yes, so quickly that he had laughed, imagining for a moment she was joking. The wedding had happened a week later. Nothing elaborate, nothing expensive. Just Fiona in a simple dress she had borrowed from a neighbor, Ciarán in a clean shirt and trousers he had bought in Clifton, and Finn, 2 months old, sleeping in Bridie Gallagher's arms. Father Seamus O'Malley had performed the ceremony. He hadn't apologized, but there was something in his words, something about how God works in mysterious ways, how love redeems souls, that had suggested he had finally understood that that marriage was not a sin, but a redemption. When Ciarán had kissed Fiona, a kiss that was delicate, respectful, full of promises, the community had applauded. The months that followed were a quiet transformation. Finn grew. His eyes began to focus, to follow his father's face as he walked across the room. His smile came one unexpected evening when Ciarán was making funny faces at him. His laughter, those first baby laughs, made Ciarán weep with joy. Fiona recovered completely. Her body returned to normal, her confidence rebuilt. And she began to cultivate again, not just for survival, but because she understood that she and Ciarán were building something that would last. The property flourished under their combined hands. What had been a crumbling structure transformed into a real home. Ciaran had built an extension, a larger room for Finn, an improved kitchen area. Fiona had planted an orchard of apple trees, berry bushes, and hardy root vegetables that would grow for years to come, feeding their family. And at night, when Finn slept between them, Ciaran had insisted it was safe, that he had researched it, that he wanted to be close to his son. They talked about the future. "I want more children," Fiona had said one night when Finn was 4 months old. "Yes?" Ciaran had asked, touching her face. "How many?" 3, 4 maybe. "A house full," Fiona had replied. "A house full of life, of laughter, of chaos." "That's possible," Ciaran had responded. "With you, everything seems possible." "I was scared," Fiona had confessed another night. "When you appeared, I was afraid you were an illusion, that you would disappear." "I won't disappear," Ciaran had promised. "As long as you want me, I'll be here." "Forever?" Fiona had asked. "Forever," Ciaran had replied, and there was a certainty in those words that left no room for doubt. And so, that story that had begun with a pregnant woman, alone, on a forgotten hillside, had transformed into something completely different. It had transformed into life, into future, into redemption. Ciaran hadn't been looking for that life when he had appeared on that track with 2 goats and a spade. He had only been looking for a place to die slowly, where his broken heart could finally stop beating. But instead, he had found Fiona, and Fiona had found him. And Finn had arrived to complete something neither of them had understood was broken. And now, in that silence of the heath, that silence that had been so heavy, so oppressive, there were voices, there was laughter, there was the breath of a baby, there were the sounds of 2 people living, truly living, instead of just existing. In truth, that story hadn't ended. In fact, it was just beginning, because Finn would grow, and there would be other children. There would be Aifa, who would be born 2 years later, with Fiona's eyes and Ciaran's smile. There would be Patrick, their 3rd child, who would inherit Ciaran's skill with the land. There would be Niamh, who would be born last of all, the joyful surprise that would close that chapter of their lives. There would be Saoirse, Ciaran's daughter, visiting from Cork when she was 16, seeing her father married, seeing her half-siblings, and finally understanding that her father hadn't abandoned her, that he had cared for her, even if from afar, even in a way she couldn't comprehend at the time. She would see Ciaran taking Saoirse to visit the property, showing her how he had fixed the roof, where the leaks had been, how he had extended the house, how he had planted that fruit orchard. And Saoirse would understand in that moment that her father had found a new kind of peace, a new kind of home. There would be Fiona growing old beside Ciaran, both working the land, both caring for their children, both living a simple life that was all they needed. Somewhere on that heath, those 2 goats, hope and memory, would continue to live, a symbol of that moment when everything had changed, when a man with nothing had arrived and had offered everything. That sometimes life doesn't offer grand moments. It offers spades and goats. It offers simple men who appear on tracks and pregnant women who are scared. It offers the silence of the heath and the promise that perhaps, just perhaps, that silence doesn't have to be lonely. It offers, in essence, the opportunity to start anew. And if you are brave enough to seize that opportunity, if you are honest enough to admit you are scared, if you are fearless enough to love, despite all the pain life has already caused you, then perhaps you will discover that that heavy silence was not a prison. It was just the space before the music began. It was just the silence before true life finally began.